The obstruction of David Bull's title has actively undermined the contract schedule fundamental to his identity as the aristocracy when the Confederates arrested him for being the Patriarchy, which then asserts the position of him as authority as the aristocracy to have been the primary chooser of the election results, especially in the Senate, and therefore the function of its byproducts in the progress of its political development as a political party, which then was contracted by the Confederates, who have infiltrated as white supremacist extremists in the Republican Party, according to the secret record, which then threatened the Democrats in order to engage in compliance as an extortion in their rebellion against the United States, which then facilitated their payoffs as a connection to the Soviet Union and its demoralization project in order to collapse the United States without firing one Russian bullet. To this extent, the continuation of that obstruction as a criminal action is the seizing illegally of faculties in order to obstruct his engagement or conversation with the government concerning its various benefits, and therefore the restoration of his faculties is essential to the sober, educated answer, is essential for the government to do if it is to engage in any action in relation to David, at which point the function of their contracts to have seized him requires the rebuttal through the system, which requires the release of his faculties in order to engage in that rebuttal, which they seized for the purpose of punishment without due process by the collapse of those contracts and their profits for the point of collapsing status and office, which they projected, at which point David, as the primary patriarchy or the elite of the aristocracy, would have had the majority political party in most states, acquiring any alteration for substantive votes concerning the elected and policies passed, at which point the customs without reason, which are void and of no authority, passed by the Confederacy, replacing the legal vote from the sober educated legislator, which required David Bulls in order to engage in that position, would have, according to their theory, established David Bulls as the intelligence oversight six-star general with Congress, and as a congressional oversight six-star general, David is essential to the education of Congress, which may not pass anything unless they engage in a sober, educated process, at which point the lack of David's access to them and the reports derived by the obstructed faculties nullifies all policies which amount to customs without reason in his absence, automatically nullifying them in their entirety, and therefore the Bill of Attainder in Expo Facto just does not nullify exclusively things applying to David, but towards everyone in general, as all of the policies are fully nullified in his absence if they were in fact not in the endorsement of the obstructed value that they projected for his original positions, at which point their argument that there are the American legal policies and not the obstruction from the unsober, uneducated response materializes their obligation to argue and prove that they were the sober, educated, original American policies and therefore qualified to continue to exist. David's network would have actively had in its components the zombie insurance and various stacking services of insurance, which would have covered the services to be rendered in the various emergencies in the insurance packages, where members of the network cover their services or products in the protection from the arrangements where the bonds pay them in order to actively have those services ready in case of the emergency, in which case the bonds pay first as they deliver the services, allowing them to stabilize through a larger period of time under their argument of David as the Holly King, providing the preservation through winter, starvation, or emergency. Their advantages or payment as a primary distributor of insurance protections is covered by the bond, which has to be paid in the same arrangement, at which point the yearly bond being paid covers the services in case of the emergency of the need of the services, exclusive to those who agree to perform those services vetted by the network's systems and algorithms. The profits derived by any of the services being arranged under that arrangement materializes the refunding of the bonds up to the amount in order to register the exact legal arguments for XYZ according to the various insurance agreements, which would then affect their bonus credit score, which then materializes their place inside of the network and their various advantages and promotions, which are an elaborate network of agreements and restrictions. This, of course, would have David's legion of lawyers included in it, as the function of conducting business actively requires specialists in law in order to engage in the active protections necessary, as lawsuits are normal to business. And to this extent, those various specialists have to be restored to David, and as the obstructed value by the federal government having engaged in the takings is obligated to replace the equivalent value, at which point eminent domain for the non-compliant members of the legal corporations who are in active obstruction would be targeted for the takings, at which point they would be compelled into compliance as a function of the Soviet Union in its plot to destroy the United States, would have their opposition to compliance under the express desire to engage in sabotaging national security as an insurgent terrorist without a legal government in their war against society, and the war against the civilian population prevents the forming of the civilian government is an act of war against the government. To this extent, their non-compliance would be viewed as an act of treachery or insurrection, etc., at which point the eminent domain would immediately compel payment, at which point the reactions that they provide in their resistance would actively determine the exact violations suspected of them when they are being federally prosecuted for any noncompliance, if that is in fact the case. Otherwise, the potential threat having been bypassed or not viably pursued under various suspicious actions would generate the various compliances in order to reform the various benefits, such as the contracting and David's brokerage, as a facet of the network, which would include the reforming of the insurance, which would then re-engage them in the obligations of its protections, which as a federal takings is an obligation for the federal government to pay to David in the restoration of his faculties. This also includes any medical attention, dentist work, or other normally considered protections, which then would actively be applied as foundational services, and to the extent that the other services, such as food, water, etc., being essential to the existence of survival, would also be included as it constructs all of the way up to more refined amenities, which would also have actively sold their services under the insurance protection package. This acknowledges the obstruction of the faculties, which includes the destruction, manipulation, editings, and forfeitures of all of the particular policies and records associated, which then creates complications concerning legitimate readings of the specific policies, which may very well have been different concerning any of the various problems that they would have constructed in the Soviet Union's war against the United States, targeting its elites, and therefore the sabotage of those agreements creates a less refined process, as the obligation to reinvestigate their existence and specific details, which is known by some, would actively be essential in its restoration, in the federal government's obligation of David's right to pursue the remedy, which requires his sober, educated answer, which requires the existence of the restoration of his faculties, which are being attacked by the act of coercion in order to undermine the legal process. It is important to note that Khrushchev's demoralization program had actively been used as an extortion by the Confederate white supremacist insurgents, who were actively losing ground without the assistance of the USSR and its teachings concerning the recreation of reality, at which point, this being a specialty of James Lindsay, would be able to expound on the specifics of that magic spell, at which point the struggle sessions, engaging in the harassment, gets people to lie for the white supremacist Communist Party, which then redistributes the function, as many important members of the Russian superior governments have stated that the Americans have been compromised and are more effective at the demoralization process than many of their confessed spies, which is a misdirection, as the function of the insurgents who are being more effective were taught to be the real mission, at which point the unitary executive theory, being a communist plot to destroy the United States, creates a no means of challenge or no appeal to the Soviets' attacks in dismantling the United States government. To this extent, its continuation required the disillusionment of the USSR once the corruption had been properly seeded into the United States, at which point their disillusionment is plausible deniability of its continued activities, which are not necessary, as the infection by the parasite continues to fester, does all of the things that they need, at which point a fundamental concept of the communists is the disillusionment of the government itself proper, at which point the disillusionment of the USSR, being a concept that was already a part of their core identity and plan, is in fact not a material weakness for them. At this point, the consideration about the denying of the USSR continuing to have been that problem is to intentionally misunderstand as gross negligence the material plot itself under the magic system, which is being communicated in its active compliance by the converted phantom cells, which has received payments for the purposes of committing treason, as they continue the rot in dismantling the civilian government of the United States and of its allies. This includes the promotion of the Confederacy, which had all but been completely destroyed, as William Barr had actively postured that they have actively lost much ground concerning all of the progress of the abuses of the federal government and its corruption, at which point needing the active boost by the USSR in order to have regained political influence, facilitated that terrorist operation of political violence and other hate crimes, where the insurgents in the Republican Party threatened the Democrats in order to gain compliance in the disillusionment of David's political party and influence through those mechanisms, as well as many of the other projected elites who, having been compromised by the intelligence community, which has discovered them in favor of their payments to commit treason for the USSR, are in active rebellion, fitting they're considered Confederates. Now, the enforcement of this communism by the demoralization processes, leveraging secret equipment stolen by the double agent insurgents, materially engaging in the war against the civilian government in separation of the civilian government in favor of the rebellion of the Confederacy in service to the USSR, which has sold the right of conquest of the United States, engages in the function of their clan terrorisms in order to engage in the insurrection against society, materializing the destabilization of the general public and its ability to engage in the normal use of their faculties, which then complicates the function of legal procedures, which they have added as a core identity objective purpose to neutralize in its entirety as they systematically dismantled the very concept of the American government as a constitutional republic in all of its various forms, including the attack against the normalization of the use of the legislative according to its agreed purpose or the judiciary according to its due purpose. To this extent, the hate crimes in those subversions undermining the legal processes leave out due process or service of law in favor of process as its own end, and therefore the consequences of process without qualified authority creating consequences as lawfare materializes the function of the Soviet Union's war against the United States to destroy it without firing a single Russian bullet. To this extent, the hate crimes from the clan terrorism materializes the active dismantlement of those faculties, and thus the defamation and embarrassment specifically derived by not being found with the owed resources, which would have made everything the original difficulty or smoothness. To this extent, the material complications being inherent are actively being denied and protected by the illegitimate functions of the misuse of the government by the insurgency engaged in the war against the civilian government. To this extent, the acts of systemic insurrection by its officers, as a self enforcing disbarring of their position, disqualifies them from their access to the government in any capacity, including the right to be employed by it or to receive benefits. If then so, it can be said that those who would not otherwise be taken seriously, being a target by these criminal subversions, being embarrassed, are in fact not defective to the point of not be taken seriously, but actively to be taken more seriously as the action of the subversion is a credible threat, is a most viable defense which must be held to their protections against these malicious abuses by the traitors undermining national security. As it is said by those in the higher levels in the United States government, that the CIA has 6 ways a Sunday to getting back at anyone who does not comply with it. At which point, the function of that as an action means the most likely application, such as the use of defamation or the use of poisonings, subversions, or illusions, which would have otherwise um, demonstrated the competency of the person, would then be used as a subversion of the person as a form of embarrassment. And therefore, I would be unlikely to take seriously someone who did in fact come across actively powerful and competent, who would have been in those positions, as the function of the retaliation would be the most likely strategy. Now, in ancient times when Hannibal was fighting the Romans, this was actively used in order to undermine the leadership authority of the emperor, which was ineffective, but its purpose is the same as the function of attacking all of the properties around of the emperor's property indicates that it is happening at the orders of the emperor, or in the very least with his consent. And therefore the destabilizing and non-destabilizing is the conformed and the non-conformed as a direct observation or suspicion, which by definition should lead all of your direct reactions as a construct whenever observing these types of things, as those worthy of being subverted would have been targeted already, and thus would already be humiliated with the defamation, which by definition is illegitimate, and therefore an act from the retaliation or the pre-subversion, etc., as an act of war against the civilian population in the seizing of it for the purposes of stopping them from forming the competent civilian government. And that civilian government, being the primary authority, is a war against the United States Constitutional Republic, which is that civilian government, relying on that population being destabilized and therefore amounting to the function of the services and applications of war applications for the coup against the United States and the subversion of national security by attacking the mechanism of forming the government. There then adds in the additional complications, such as the previously noted example with Hannibal's tactic of the misdirection to make that the common assumed thing as the most obvious probability would be used as additional complications by other foreign actors, as the function of the Confederacy is in fact separate to the United States, and not engaging in the service of law is undermining national security in that capacity, and therefore directly or indirectly through various mechanisms, including the leverage of other federal governments, could be materializing that outcome. And if not, then the continued manipulation by those foreign governments require the release of the restoration of the title of David Bulls and the other obstructed elites in order to finish the proper investigation, in order to do so competently, which actively being counteracted by the CIA and others would be tantamount to a confession to participation as opposed to being undermined in the application of the use of their policy of plausible deniability, otherwise referred to as gross negligence, otherwise referred to as criminal intent. These processes require people to cover for them or to lie for the communist revolution. And to that extent, the mechanism of ignoring it so that they could punish the victims for being victims and therefore make you hate the victims and love the abusers materializes the consistent enforcement of these illusions, which are compounding effects, which then generates the precedent of everything that they would be running away from as they run into the trap because of their approval of the precedent, which is the repackaging and distribution of the service of having conducted the illusion in the first place, which makes more of the product as it is the funding of it, which increases its distribution, which then materializes the realization of its existence. And therefore, in that action of the increased use of the convenient product of fruit of the poison tree, materializes your active distribution of its existence inside the population on precedent, which then will inevitably come back to you as its entire existence is derived by your contemptible or others' contemptible behavior of having approved of it, which grew to that level, and therefore those who ascended by the contemptible funding materializing the contempt for those who have funded them into their prosperity is proof of the viability of the Communist Party and the inferiority of those who were essential to its ascension, until they are ritually consumed by the devil, empowered by their own hands. Now, the destruction and subversions and illusions generated by this position should not be misunderstood in a historic position, such as the position of the recreation of the Israeli state after the Babylonians had destroyed them, having proven in the Bill of Rights for the Babylonians that they had a right to reconstruction of the Temple of Solomon. The Persian king wondered at the position on how they would even have destroyed this, as it's tantamount to a mountain. He didn't know how he was going to recreate it. He didn't know how they destroyed it. But the presumption of his that it had existed, derived by the reinforcement of any of his servants who would have conducted the proper spy work necessary to have convinced him, as he would not have been defrauded so quickly or easily by such a mischievous scheme, is understood as its own outcome. And to this extent, the mechanism of him having proven that he believed it so materializes the evidence that it had been, and therefore the complete destruction of such a monumental site includes the absolute completeness of the destruction of that society, which had been otherwise quite prosperous according to their confession. And to this extent, that materialization proves the viability of Solomon and King David according to his co-signing of its existence, and therefore the co-signing of its existence having been so utterly destroyed as to have accomplished the impossible, and that he, having surveyed it, believed that this otherwise impossible thing was in fact something that he was responsible under the Bill of Rights to do, as his mechanism of investigation had been thoroughly supported by a conquered people who would not have been able to trick him otherwise. The confession by that record is the realization of its proof of the existence of the obstructed faculties. To this extent, the completeness of that eradication as a purging for the purposes of rewriting history without that Bill of Rights being respected by the government would have a completely different result, which would actively be the ambition of the Confederates in their enforcement of white supremacist communism in the eradication of the Americans' culture and the faculties derived by each person and the interrelationship with others connected to those obstructed faculties, which otherwise would have had freedom of association, including the freedom of contract and the right to the pursuit of happiness under the right of associations and so forth. To this extent, that materializes the function of the completeness of the destruction historically of parties intended to be eradicated by those particular groups, similar to the evidence of the white supremacist extermination of the black town or of the white supremacist insurrection overthrowing the North Carolina black elected leadership, which then materializes the full destruction of those evidences as to have drowned the black successful town in a lake in order to conceal the evidence. That, as a point of primary strategy, as intended to be reinforced according to that position, is a direct violation of constitutional law as an act of insurrection for the insubordination of double agents in their endorsement of the Soviet Union's plot to destroy the United States by its traitors paid off by the Soviet Union, known as the Confederacy or white supremacist communism. All this to say that the lawfare, on the foundation of the various prohibitions, is a generation of the product being prohibited and therefore is disqualified at its foundation, as it being distributed is criminalized for distribution, and therefore the distributor distributing is in the government disqualified from service of law and therefore does not have the authority and therefore is actively engaging in the criminal act prohibited, and therefore must be dissolved, as the aiding and abetting for its convenience and the support of the tactics used for its convenience would then materialize in the function of mutual aiding and abetting, which then would mutually engage in the distribution of any prohibitions, therefore generating the contest of the defamations in many cases derived by the restraints of faculties in order to facilitate the defamation operations with this series of criminal compounding effects with cosigners who, having been guilty of all of the violations by their cosign, become criminally liable and therefore dissolve the right for the policy to exist or series of policies in order to exist according to the racist dog whistle, as they are a weapon and not a means of themselves, and to this extent lose their authority to exist, and to that end materialize their disillusionment as an obligation in the custom without reason, which is void and of no authority. To this extent, the material restoration of David Bull's title, amongst others, who have been targeted by those terrorist operations and their various tactics, have to engage in its full restoration, including the payment of the takings, which would then, upon that point, have the capacity, without the coercion and censorship, to have materialized the reports competent enough, legitimate enough to give to Congress and others in order to engage in material changes. As they would be competent enough for Congress, the presumption is that it is therefore convincing and therefore would be supported for the consistent changes specifically connected to it, therefore engaging in the function of its full transformation towards that direction, which would have been the motive of the coercion in order to prevent that very result in the first place, which would have generated the compounded liabilities of the guilty engaging in the communist suppression for the purpose of destroying society, and therefore all of the gross negligence compounding interest of the liabilities and intended side effect damages as a byproduct. Another plausible deniability is the entirety of the bill of the consequence, which is the full federal debt that they are to be paying, as it is specifically directed by the takings of the government, and therefore a function of themselves as a crime committed against the government, and therefore is a federal debt to the government, and therefore is an obligation to pay the federal government that takings cost, which it has to front towards the victims that it, under gross negligence, tolerated the criminal injury towards, creating the liability that must be resolved. And their disruption being fundamental to the charismatic socialism, disrupting the elegance of speech essential to the natural influence in order to prevent the legal outcome from happening in the rebellion against the nation of law, presumes the obligation of its restoration as the only means of engaging a service of law or the use of the American court structure, which is contractually bound to fairness, which, by definition, does not mean a taxi fare. It is not a nonsensical thing that is not understood. Fairness, balanced, quality, correctness, service of law, these are all competent things with material side effects that were already understood, and engagement of bad faith in order to disqualify that fairness is a disqualification of the authority of the government, is the disillusionment of any protections of the office of the normal enforcement of X, Y, or Z, as the function is not being used as X, Y, or Z under the office, but is exploiting the office for the theft of its equipment, for the misuse and corruption of the outcome in order to defraud the record, the system, and the government into complete and total collapse for the Soviet Union that they are committing treason for and on behalf of.